Hey y'all, Pastor. We are in the second week of our Bible study entitled Everyday Church, which is functionally just a way to get us into First Peter. Now, last week I had you watch a video about decline in attendance in churches in America, and also attached a report to the Pew Research Center about religious identity in the United States. And if you haven't checked those out, I'm going to encourage you to. And if you have and you're here for the week, before we go any further, I want you to just go ahead and pause this video, because there's another resource with another short video that I'd like you to watch before we dive into this one. So with that being said, pause it and then come back when you're done. All right, I'm assuming you've either watched it already or you're here. So what I want to do is let's go ahead and dive into what your reading homework for last week was, which was to read 1 Peter verses 1 through 12. Now, if you watched the video about exile, I hope something sort of helped answer a question that I included in last week's study guide, which is, why do you think Peter used the language of exiles when he was talking to this early church? And in the video, I think it does a better job than I could of, and something about animation just helps it stick, that exile is sort of the fundamental and foundational identity of the people of Israel. So in that video, it specifically talked about the Israelites returning from exile out of Babylon. And we'll find out that later in the letter, Peter really confirms this. He says something about writing from Babylon. But this letter starts off saying, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion. Now, the dispersion was something that was specifically referring to those people that had been exiled to Babylon. Some people called it the diaspora. And in this case, he's writing to these Christians in 5 different areas that are all functionally Roman provinces in what would be modern-day Turkey. And he is writing to this early church, and he decides to use this language to all the chosen exiles, tying right back to that identity of an exiled people that are looking for and anticipating a king to return. That's pretty fitting, right? So hopefully by now you're starting to see what Peter's doing. In one verse, he drops like almost an entire sermon. It just says, to the chosen exiles in these areas, and we're supposed to know immediately, as are the people reading this letter, like, oh, we are part of that identity. That's crazy. And then he goes on to say, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, this is verse 2, in the sanctification of the Spirit, it says, for obedience to Jesus Christ. And I want you to hear this last verse, and for sprinkling with his blood. Now, what the video doesn't really go into nearly as much is that, yes, there is the culture of exile coming out of Babylon, but that identity rooted in exile goes all the way back to the very beginning of the people of God. So specifically, when he mentions sprinkling with his blood, what Peter is harking back to is another exile, but this time a positive one. Peter is pointing back to the exile of the people of God in Egypt, and how they were taken out of Egypt into sort of a new exile, to become new sojourners, to become new travelers in the wilderness as they were formed into a new people. And that was symbolized and confirmed after God gives them the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai, and they seal this new promise, this new covenant, with the sprinkling of blood on an altar and the sprinkling of blood on his people, saying that you are now mine. So now we have in 2 verses, Peter has done 2 things. He's called this early church back to a story, the exiled people coming out of Babylon. And then he calls them back to an earlier story, the exiled people of God coming out of Egypt. And he's writing to this new church, setting up a framework with which he wants to talk about what it means to be the church where they. Okay, so there you have it. That's a lot. We could probably end it right there, right? But if you want to just stick with me, he then goes on to continue to deepen that understanding of what it means. So to be the exiled people of God, whether it's in Exodus or whether it's coming out of Babylon, means that they are a people of a promise, that they are people and inheritors of a promise. And Peter goes on to say, like, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. So he's kind of got that good sermon stuff. He says, according to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you. So verses 3 and 4, he sets up what it means to be the people of God and be part of that story. It's one that the Jewish Christians would have understood really intimately, which is that they are people of a promised land, and a promised role in the kingdom, and a promised covenant set of just mercies that they would have through Yahweh, through their God. And he's saying, because of God and through Jesus Christ, you are now part of that inheritance promise. That's an amazing thing. And it's an inheritance that's not going to spoil. It's not like money. It's not like clothing or stuff. This is an inheritance that is being preserved for you when Christ returns. Very cool stuff. Well, now he goes on and he says, but I understand that things aren't always great. And he says, in this, though, he says, oh, yeah, let me go back to verse 5. It says, who by God's power are being guarded through faith for salvation, ready to be revealed in the last time. Okay, I want you to hold on to that. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, that for a salvation to be revealed. In other words, well, wait a minute. We as Christians say we're already saved, and he's saying that there's a salvation yet to come. Okay, just hold on to that. But he goes on to say, in this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith may be found to result in praise and glory and at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Lots of churchy words. Let me break that down for you. Peter is saying, I know stuff still sucks. I know it's still hard, and you guys are having some tough issues right now in your regions. But know that all of the suffering, all it's doing is, he says testing, that's a fancy word. We use that word differently now, but when he uses the word testing, he's talking about the way that they would purify metals, right? Get the impurities out. He's saying in the suffering, you are being purified. He's not necessarily saying the suffering is the purification is the reason for the suffering, but he's saying that in the midst of your trials, he says you are being given a more genuine faith. And then he pretty much goes on to say, and you will be that much more overjoyed when you actually get to see Jesus face to face. And this is this really cool aside he says at the very end, in verses 8 and 9, he's though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory. I want you to remember who writes this letter. It is Peter, one of Jesus' close friends, the one that did see Jesus. And personally, I think it's a really neat thing that Peter's saying, y'all never saw him, but you love him. And Peter does know what it means to love Jesus. He says, y'all don't see him now, but you believe in him. And Peter believed in him after he saw the resurrected Jesus. And then he goes on to follow up this. He says, obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. It's this cool moment where it says, you are just as much a part of the story, even though you weren't there like we were. That's amazing. All right, so we've got a 2 out of 3 part movement that sets them up for what we will talk about over the next few weeks. So first, he says, you are chosen exiles. You are part of Israel now too. And then he goes on to say, and you get to share in that promise, that inheritance. Man, that's really amazing that you are holding on to that promise because you never have even seen Jesus. You didn't grow up in this promise, but you're holding it as your own. And it is through that clinging to that promise that is bringing you the salvation that you're hoping for. And then he goes on to say one more thing, which is that they have a unique role in this, that these non-Jewish Christians, they are experiencing something really, truly amazing that even he or his friends or the other that were holders of this promise, they had not experienced. He says concerning this salvation, that thing that you're clinging to, he says the prophets who prophesied were inquiring when that person would come. So verses 10 and 11 are saying the prophets, those people that we're looking back to confirm who Jesus is. Don't forget, there's no Bible written yet. They just have the writings of the prophets. They have the Torah. It says, these people that are looking towards Jesus, he says, they never got to see him. They were hoping he would show up, and they realized they were writing about another people. And he says, and y'all are those people. He says it was revealed to them, says in verse 12, that they were serving not themselves, but you. What an amazing thing. And he says at the very end that you were revealed good news and things into which angels long to look. He says, man, even the angels wish that they could be in your place. So the title of our series is Everyday Church. And that's what we're going to do over the next few weeks is we'll continue to take the rest of the letter of 1 Peter and see, well, what does it mean for us to be the everyday church? But before Peter ever talks to that community, that Christian community, about what it meant to be the church, he took time to remind them of who they were as the church. Now, we're in a really unique, strange time right now where we're not able to gather in person for worship services, to sing songs together. I'm in the process of doing a Bible study from my bedroom. That's pretty cool, but we're not able to interact. I don't know that you actually paused the video earlier. I don't know if you've actually read the guides. I don't know if you are actually that far in the video that we're having this conversation right now. But here's the thing. Before we can talk about what it looks like to maybe boost attendance at churches, or how do we reach the lost, or how do we stave off the tide of millennials leaving the church, I think it's important, just like Peter's doing here, to remind ourselves of who we are. When Peter is telling the early church here that they are the chosen exiles, the elect exiles, he's saying us too. We are also Israel, and that's an important thing. We are not just people that happen to all believe that Jesus is God and go sing songs on Sundays, but we are now sharers in that same exile story. The history that we read about in Jeremiah or in 1st and 2nd Kings, the history that we read about in Exodus and in Joshua when they go into this new land, or when they're strangers in a land, that's our history too. And that inheritance they look forward to, that promise that the king was going to make them a nation set apart and was going to come and redeem it and redeem them, that's our promise too, because of Jesus. And we also have a really unique place in that history of God's people, because we are holding to a promise in Jesus, though we've never seen him. And it's amazing. And even though we may be suffering in certain ways, I mean, it may be hard right now being stuck in your house, but it's good to remember that all of that is actively shaping and processing and just like shaping who we are in Jesus Christ, right? It's testing us. It's getting the impurities out. So before we go any further, that's what I want to leave you with today. Peter is telling this church in these provinces in what is now Turkey, he's saying, y'all are part of a story now. And it's good to remember what that story is. And that same is true for you and I, which is we are also part of this story. And it is one that's worth remembering and rooting everything else we do as the church. Now, a couple of little notes is what I want you to do is I want you to go ahead this week and just read verses 13 through 25 of chapter 1 in 1 Peter. We're going to move slow because it's even though it's a short letter, it's a dense one. And I've got just 2 questions that I want you to consider. Well, 3. You know what? I'll give you 3 questions to consider. Okay, and I'll include them in the follow along guide. Question number 1: are there any spots where you see that the language changes? In other words, does something get offset in terms of type? Does it look like, why are they setting this up? Something that maybe you would see in a book of poetry. That's question number 1. And if you see it, go ahead and write it down. And I want you to see if you can find out where it's from. The second thing too is, in this passage, how many Old Testament references do you see? Question number 2. All right. So 1, do you see any weird poems? 2, how many Old Testament questions do you see? And then thirdly, the last question I want you to consider as you read is I want you to set aside for yourself and say, what does it mean to have the qualities that are listed in verse 13 if I'm going to be a follower of Jesus? Okay? So there we go. 1, any strange poems. 2, how many Old Testament references are you seeing? And 3, what does it look like for you? What does it look like for you to embody the qualities that are listed in verse 13? With that being said, thank you for taking time. Grace and peace, blessings, and I'll see you next week.